plans to amend the Burma bill by adding about $7 billion in spending for FEMA to use in responding to natural disasters around the country. From 12:30 to 2:15, the Senate will recess for their weekly party lunches. And now to live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Let us pray. Eternal God, who fulfills the desires of those who have reverence for your name, let your will be done today on Capitol Hill. Give our senators a clear understanding of your providential purposes so that they will not deviate from your desired plan. Inspire them to seek your guidance and depend on you to bring them through the myriad challenges of our time. Lord, infuse them with a spirit of reconciliation that will break down divisive walls, bringing harmony and cooperation. Strengthen them for this day's journey as your Spirit empowers them to faithfully honor you in their thoughts, words, and deeds. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
Join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Have a good day, ladies. Enjoy.
The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., September 13, 2011. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Jeanne Shaheen, a senator from the state of New Hampshire, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President Pro Tempore.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. Alexander. Miss Ayotte.
President.
The Majority Leader.
I would ask you now to consent the call to quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Polling any leader remarks, the Senate will be on morning business for an hour. The majority will control the first half. The Republicans will control the final half. Following that morning business, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to H.J. Res. 66. This legislation is the vehicle that we need to do the FEMA funding. The Senate will recess, as we always do on Tuesdays, from 12:30 to 2:15 for our weekly caucus meetings. Madam President, this week, the Republicans sent a message to victims of devastating hurricanes, wildfires, and tornadoes. That message was tough luck. Last night, we tried to move forward on a measure that would have granted Federal Emergency Management Agency additional funding to help communities devastated by natural disasters. This ought to be the least political issue we have, whether to reach out a helping hand to our friends and neighbors in time of need. These unfortunate people have lost friends and loved ones. They've lost their homes, businesses, and livelihoods. And they've been destroyed by acts of God. I don't see that in any way to be. I went over this with my wife last night, and she said, "Why would you use a term like that?" Well, in the law, that's what these floods, these terrible windstorms, these fires, they're acts of God. We can't plan for them. They just happen. And in the law, that's a term of art that we use. These people have lost loved ones and friends and property, are underwater or reduced to rubble, literally. It's in our power to help them. It's an obligation we have to help them. But last night, Republicans overwhelmingly voted to prevent us from coming to their aid. They prevented us from getting disaster aid to American families and businesses that need it now. These unfortunate people, I repeat, don't need the help next week or next month or 6 months from now. They need it now, today. It's really unthinkable that Republicans would waste time catering to the radical Tea Party while innocent victims of devastating disasters bide their time. One of the leaders of the Tea Party, a member of the House of Representatives, has said very publicly that FEMA, we should get rid of it. But, Madam President, this is not a nation that stands idly by while our fellow Americans suffer. We're a nation of action. That's what we've always been. When it is in our power to aid a fellow citizen, we've always done what it takes. And we've done it without politics, without pandering, without a moment's delay, until today. This year, the United States has dealt with more than its usual share of terrible natural disasters. Hurricane Irene is estimated to be one of the most costly disasters ever to hit this country. It caused flooding and wind damage from Florida to Maine. That's a long ways. It's a huge coastline. But its damage was not with only the coastline. An interior state like Vermont suffered terrible damage. Hundreds of bridges, hundreds, plural, I repeat, in Vermont. Scores of bridges in the presiding officer state of New Hampshire. Crops were drowned all over the Northeast. Rarely has this ever happened. Just a few short weeks ago, an earthquake that we have not had in this part of the country for 65 years occurred. The epicenter was in Virginia. It was felt by tens of millions of people in every corner of the eastern United States. It damaged buildings in Richmond and closed the Washington Monument. The National Cathedral had some of its spires damaged. It's closed now. The 9/11 celebration was to take place there. Had to move it to the Kennedy Center. The Mormon temple that we see as we drive down the Beltway, spires were knocked off. Some of the spires were knocked off that. Record flooding in the Mississippi and Missouri rivers has cost lives and devastated farmland. To get a picture of the devastation, 3 million acres of farmland is underwater now. This isn't rice that grows there. These are crops that needs to be able to be away from that much water. It's devastated the farmland in that part of the country. In February, a massive blizzard buried the Midwest and Northeast with as much as 3 feet of snow, paralyzing the city of Chicago, and 36 people died. Even now, firefighters are battling terrible wildfires that have raged for weeks and weeks across central Texas. Those fires have killed people and driven residents from their homes that they'll never see again. Mr. President, in Texas, 2,000 homes have been burned to the ground. Since January, Texas has reported, this is not a misstatement, 20,000 fires since January. Some of the small fires developed into big fires, burning almost 4 million acres of land. The State Forest Service in Texas responded to 19 new fires on Sunday alone in 24 hours, almost a new fire an hour in Texas. This year, President Obama has issued disaster declarations in 48 states, and it's only September. Some states have had multiple disasters. The United States has had $10 billion disasters. We've had $10 billion disasters already this year. It's no wonder that there's limited monies left in FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund. FEMA has spent about $400 million in the last 2 weeks alone making whole American families affected by Irene and Lee, the tropical storm and the the hurricane. In short, FEMA's running out of money. They're almost broke. Funds are so low, FEMA stopped rebuilding Joplin, Missouri, where more than 150 people died in a terrible tornado. FEMA has programs where they were rebuilding the schools and some of the public services that are so necessary. They wanted to have enough money to do the food, water, and emergency housing for victims of Hurricane Irene, so they pulled out of Joplin, Missouri. And we've seen the pictures. Hard to comprehend what winds blowing almost 300 miles an hour does. It just eliminates everything on the ground. Any structure eliminated. This is not some some Democratic idea that's come about, we need to fund FEMA. Republican governors are desperate for money. They've seen the destruction firsthand. I'll pick just two. Governor of New Jersey, Governor Christie, said this, and I quote, "Our people are suffering now and they need support now." Governor McDonnell of Virginia said this, I quote, "My concern is that we help people in need." And he responded in that way because the Republican majority leader of the House said what we need to do is make sure that these emergencies are paid for by taking money from programs that are now in existence. We cannot be held hostage in this issue to appease the Tea Party. Hundreds of millions of dollars in disaster recovery projects are on hold. I mentioned Joplin, Missouri as just one example. No matter how often we wish for a crystal ball, the process of guessing how much money we'll need for natural disasters isn't perfect. We try, but this has been a very, very devastating year. Each year, Congress estimates how much it will cost this country to recover from inevitable storms and wildfires and floods. And then it reacts to what Mother Nature sends our way. Now is the time to react. It's time to show Americans, as we did in the wake of September 11th, that when disaster strikes, the federal government will be there to help rebuild. These are very hard personal issues. Here in Virginia, a suburb of Washington, a 12-year-old boy was out watching it rain. He was swept off his back step, and he's dead. Scores of people have been killed just with Lee and Irene. It's time for Republicans to prove this Congress, for one of the first times, that they're willing to put politics aside for the good of the American people. FEMA is an issue that is bipartisan in nature. Those storms don't just hit Democrats. They don't just hit Republicans. They just don't hit Republicans. The independents, they hit us all. And that's why we have to react, help everybody in America, because everyone's been hurt.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
Madam President, last week President Obama came up to Capitol Hill to unveil a stimulus bill he's calling a jobs plan. And yesterday the White House explained how they'd like to pay for it. The first thing to say about this plan is that it's now obvious why the President left out the specifics last week. Not only does it reveal the political nature of this bill, it also reinforces the growing perception that this administration isn't all that interested in economic policies that will actually work. But none of this is really news. Over the past few days, press reports have made it perfectly clear that this legislation is more of a re-election plan than a jobs plan. It's an open secret which Democrats all over Washington have been acknowledging to reporters since the moment the President revealed it. They've said that despite the President's calls to pass this bill immediately, the real plan is to let it hang out there for a while so Democrats can use it as an issue on the campaign trail. What's more, the President knew as well as I did when he unveiled this plan that Democrats in the Senate had already scheduled a full slate of legislative business for the next few weeks. So unless the White House wants to admit that it has no regard for its own party's legislative business in Congress, the President's call for immediate action was clearly little more than rhetorical flourish. But the speeches we got yesterday only reinforced the impression that this was largely a political exercise. For one, they undermine the President's claim that it's a bipartisan proposal because much of what he's proposing has already been rejected on a bipartisan basis. The $500 billion tax hike the White House proposed yesterday will not only face a tough road in Congress among Republicans, but from Democrats, too. The central tax hike included in this bill, capping deductions for individuals and small businesses, was already dismissed by a filibuster-proof Democratic-controlled Senate in 2009. Another idea floated by the White House yesterday, a tax on investment income, has been vehemently opposed by the number 3 Democrat in the Senate, among others. And a proposal to raise taxes on the oil and gas industry was rejected as a job-destroying tax hike by both Democrats and Republicans just a few months ago. And for good reason, since the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service tells us it would only raise gas prices, and it would also, in addition to raising gas prices, move jobs overseas. So claiming this bill is bipartisan may sound good if you're out there on the campaign trail, but surely the President could come up with some proposals that both sides had not already rejected. Here's how one prominent left-leaning analyst put it yesterday. These aren't new policy ideas, he wrote. The Obama administration has been looking to cap itemized deductions since the 2009 budget, nor are they bipartisan policy ideas. The specifics we got yesterday were disappointing for another reason as well. Not only have they failed to attract wide bipartisan support in the past, even if they did enjoy bipartisan support, they wouldn't create any jobs. The President knows raising taxes is the last thing you want to do to spur job creation. He said so himself. Yet that's basically all he's proposing here, temporary stimulus to be paid for later by permanent tax hikes, so that when the dust clears and the economy is no better off than it was after the first stimulus, folks find themselves with an even bigger tax bill than today. Now, the President can call this bill whatever he wants, but in reality, all he's doing is just proposing a hodgepodge of retread ideas aimed at convincing people that a temporary fix is really permanent and that it will create permanent jobs, and then daring Republicans to vote against it. Well, I think most people see through all of this. I think most Americans are smarter than that. I think they know our economic challenges are more serious than this and that they require serious long-term solutions. I think the American people realize we can do a lot better. I've talked with a lot of job creators over the past few weeks, including many in my own state. It's no secret what they need to create jobs. Every one of them says the same thing, and yet the President refuses to do any of it. If the President is truly interested in growing the economy and putting Americans back to work, then he'll leave the temporary proposals and the half measures and the tax hikes aside. He'll consult with both parties and work with us on a plan that indicates he's learned something from the failures of the past 2 years, and which actually has a chance of attracting bipartisan support. He could start with a permanent reform of our broken tax system, reducing out-of-control federal regulations, and by passing the trade bills that have been sitting on his desk since Inauguration Day 2009. All of this is doable. All of it should attract bipartisan support, and all of it would actually create jobs. Now, that would be a jobs plan worthy of the seriousness of the moment. But make no mistake, what the President proposed so far is not serious, and it's not a jobs plan. After what we learned yesterday, that should be clear to everyone. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half and the Republicans controlling the final half.
Madam President.
The senator from Illinois.
Madam President, I listened carefully to the statement made by the Republican leader. I noticed that for the last few days, the Republicans have been very quiet and calm and circumspect in their reaction to the President's speech to a joint session of Congress last Thursday night. The President, of course, came to us and said, this economy needs a helping hand. We've got to step in and do something. We've got to act and act now. And he came up with a list of proposals Thursday night that I think really do address what America needs. First and foremost, to create jobs. That's the #1 priority. The President says we'll do this by creating tax incentives for small businesses in particular, to hire people who've been unemployed and to give raises to those who currently work. He knows that families are struggling across America, working families, middle-class families, many of them living paycheck to paycheck. Madam President, a recent poll asked working families in America how many could come up with $2,000 in 30 days, either from savings or borrowing, to meet a medical emergency, for example. It turns out barely half of Americans can do so. Working families, barely half of them could come up with $2,000. It's a reminder to many of us who have a comfortable life that the vast majority of working families struggle every single month to make ends meet. President Obama understands that, and that's why he's proposed a payroll tax cut that will put more money in the hands of working families. In Illinois, it'll be an average of about $1,400 a year. I wish it were more. But it's a recognition by the President that to get this economy moving again, people have to have more confidence in their own situation at home and more confidence in the future. Giving working families this spending power can make that difference. The President also understands, and I'm sure the presiding officer understands as well, that many of the families that are unemployed now are desperate. I visited with many of them during the August recess, going to the Elgin Work Center and to others in McHenry County. I sat down with these people who've been out of work for months, some even years, and asked them, what is your day like? They come to these job centers, they sit down, they work on their resumes, they pour through all of the want ads, they pour through all of the information about people seeking new employees, and they send out their resumes as quickly as possible. And of course, very, very few of them get any response at all. It's a desperate situation. Some of them have lost their homes. Some of them are seeing their kids returning back from college, unable to continue their studies because Dad's out of work. Some of the marriages that have been involved have been strained and some have failed because of this economic hardship. The President understands that, and I hope we do too. Unemployment compensation is absolutely essential as a lifeline to these families, and the President makes that part of his package. When I hear the Republican leader call these suggestions a hodgepodge, I don't think he's fair and I don't think he's just. Take a look at the specifics. Incentives for businesses to hire new workers, payroll tax cuts for working families for more spending money in hand, unemployment compensation for those who are out of work so they can survive. The President also focuses on critical people. How many of us in the last 48 hours have given a speech somewhere at home or here talking about the great first responders of 9/11? The policemen, the firefighters, the medical professionals who literally risked and some even gave their lives in response to that national emergency. We know what's happening across America. Many of these policemen and firefighters are losing their jobs, along with teachers. The President understands that, and he puts resources in to saving some of those jobs so that we can have the protection we need in our community and the teachers we need for the next generation of workers. And President Obama believes, and I agree, that we need to invest in America. When we build America, when we build the infrastructure that will serve us in the 21st century, we create good-paying jobs right here at home. These aren't jobs you're going to ship overseas, and President Obama understands that. That's why that's a major part of his proposal. We're talking about highways and bridges and airports and ports and waterways and schools. The President understands that that investment in America not only helps us today in invigorating the economy, but will pay off for generations to come. Madam President, there were very few lines the President gave at his speech that drew standing applause from the Republican side. I felt at one point that the temperature on the Republican side of the aisle, the House chamber, was 40 degrees below that on the Democratic side. It was cold over there. There was one line that they finally acknowledged, and that was when the President said, for goodness sakes, we owe it to our veterans who've come home to put them to work, to know that 10% of those people who risked their lives for America and are now back home or in unemployment lines is absolutely unacceptable. And President Obama recognizes that in what he has called for to get this economy moving forward. I don't think the Republican leader is fair in calling this a hodgepodge. I think it is a carefully constructed plan to get this economy moving forward. What really troubles the Republican leader, and I know he said as much this morning, is that President Obama pays for it. Over and over again, we hear from the Republican side, don't add to the deficit, pay for what you do. The President came out yesterday with his proposals of how to pay for it. And how does he pay for it? For one, he takes away the subsidy to the oil companies, a federal subsidy that comes right out of the Treasury, going to oil companies across America that are raising gasoline prices to the roof and enjoying the biggest business profits in the history of the United States. Isn't it time to cut back on that subsidy and use those resources for the President's plan to get the economy moving forward? And yes, the President does limit the tax deductions and credits for those in higher income categories. I just find it hard to understand why the Republican position is we cannot ask those who are well off, the most comfortable people in America, to pay 1 penny more in taxes. Their position is absolute. Not 1 penny more in taxes for the wealthiest in America. I think that it's fair to limit the tax cuts for the wealthiest so that we can provide tax cuts for working families. That, to me, is sensible. It's not only morally right, it's economically right. And it troubles me when I hear the Republican leader reject that out of hand. It appears that the warmth of the August sun is cooling now in September, and those who went home and heard how unhappy America is with congressional roadblocks and obstruction, they've forgotten that lesson. They've forgotten what they heard. They're coming back now and saying, once again, we're going to have a face-off and a confrontation. There's one other area I want to speak to. I know my colleague from New York is going to be on the floor shortly. The area I want to speak to is disaster relief. I strongly support the disaster relief funding bill. As Americans undertake the physically and emotionally difficult task of rebuilding, cleaning up, and recovering from hurricanes and flooding and even earthquakes, we must see that disaster funds are there so that they can get back to their own lives as quickly as possible. 2011 has been a record year when it comes to natural disasters. The cost of recovery from Hurricane Irene alone could reach $1.5 billion. Illinois, we've seen it this year, it's been tough. From Chicago to Cairo in the southern part of our state, we've had blizzards and floods and tornadoes and troubles all around. Our state, like most other states, has seen the damage, has felt it personally. People are trying to put their homes back together again. Here's a photo which I saw in person when I visited my state earlier this spring around Cairo, Illinois, in the southern part of the state. It was an awful situation. We had flooding along the Ohio River, which troubled and bothered the folks that lived in southern Illinois as well as Kentucky and adjoining states and Missouri. And some of our towns like Cairo were literally threatened with being inundated. They had to blow levees, which basically means open up a place for the river water to flow, and that flooded farmland in Missouri and Illinois. And we've got to be sensitive to the fact that there were real losses there that need to be paid for. That record flooding really slammed the southern part of our state. The devastation was felt in the entire region. The damage wasn't just there, though. I hear from people throughout the southern part of the state who are still struggling today because of this flooding. Anthony Miles in Urbandale, Illinois, is an example. Flooding from the Ohio River rose so high his home that he couldn't even find his lawnmower in the front yard. All he could see was river water. In Metropolis, Illinois, my friend Mayor Billy McDaniel says people are still trying to get the floodwater damage repaired in that town months later. The Harrah's Casino in Metropolis, which is a major employer and source of revenue in the area, completely inundated with water and hundreds of thousands of dollars of repairs that need to be done. Now, there are some who argue that when it comes to these disasters, we can't afford to help people in America. It appears to me that the guiding principle and motto of the Tea Party in America is this: just remember, we're all in this alone. That's what we hear over and over from them. Whenever we've got a problem facing us in America where we come together as a family to solve it, the Tea Party stands on the sidelines and says, don't do it. Let them fail. Senator Reid this morning quoted a leading Tea Party advocate in the House who said the Federal Emergency Management Agency should be put out of business. I wonder where he lives. I wonder if his home has been spared. I wonder if he's seen people who, through no fault of their own, have lost everything because of a disaster. When that happens in America, we step up and help one another. We don't get tied up in some political debate. We don't find ourselves completely stopped from stepping forward and doing the right thing. And we can't let it happen this time either. Those who say that we have to cut other government programs in education, medical research, for example, to pay for devastation, whether it's from Hurricane Irene or flooding or earthquakes or tornadoes, I just don't think they understand that there are critical areas of government spending that have been cut back already, and to cut them even further would jeopardize the future of this country and the well-being of many, many families. Madam President, I want to show a chart here which demonstrates the amount requested by the administration over the years, different presidents, for the Disaster Relief Fund. In each and every one of these cases, regardless of whether it was a Democratic administration or Republican, how much of these funds do you think were offset with funds from other accounts in the federal budget? None. Zero. In 2000, when more than $3.5 billion was appropriated for disaster recovery, how much was offset? None. In 2005 and 2006, when communities all over the South were recovering from Hurricane Katrina, and more than $2 billion was appropriated in each of these 2 years for recovery, how much of that was offset? None. Under Republican presidents like President Bush, as well as Democratic presidents like President Clinton and Obama, We have not required offsets in the rest of the budget when we have literally faced a disaster. We have stepped up, provided the money, and moved forward. The number and cost of disasters has grown dramatically over the past few years. I don't want to engage the Senate in the debate about climate change because I know that people get red in the face and want to come to the floor and tell us their political views of the science of this question. But I will tell you this. The Property and Casualty Insurance Industry of America testified before my committee recently and said they see what's coming. More disasters and more costs than we ever imagined. One of the experts said, be prepared to say every summer of your life from this point forward, this is the hottest summer I can ever remember. That's what the future is going to hold. And as these temperature swings get worse and worse, they precipitate these terrible storms. I'm not an expert on much, but I am perhaps a little bit of an expert after almost 30 years of flying 48 round trips a year between Illinois and Washington on flying on commercial airplanes. I think I know a little bit about that, maybe a little more than most. This has been one of the roughest periods I could ever remember. For the last several months, the storms and turbulence have been greater than I can ever recall. I hope it's an anomaly. Hope it never happens again. We're told by the experts it's likely to continue. It means more storms, more damage, more disasters. And we don't have a fund sitting somewhere in Washington waiting to pay for it. We've got to step up as the need arises and meet our obligation to the families and businesses that have been negatively affected. We know that this damage, which I showed in the southern part of my state, reaches all over the state. This is an area of Galena, Illinois, home area of General Grant and President Ulysses S. Grant. And this area up in the northwestern part of my state also has been flooded, causing extreme damage to the people in the area. It's just another example of what we've been through. If we freeze the money for disaster relief, as some have suggested, it means that repairs being made to recover from floods and storms from April and May won't be reimbursed. For Metropolis, Illinois and southern Illinois, they are facing damage there that needs to be repaired, the city of Carmi as well. On Friday, President Obama requested $5 billion in new disaster funding, $500 million in supplemental money for the fiscal year 2011. The President recognizes that 2011 has been an exceptional year for natural disasters and that recovery from Hurricane Irene alone could tax FEMA way beyond what it's capable of providing for. This money is and businesses who are trying to clean up and put their lives back on track. I strongly support the supplemental appropriations for the Disaster Relief Fund. Let's help our fellow Americans get back on their feet. Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the end.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.
And I ask that the quorum call be set aside.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to honor a fallen hero, Nebraska Army National Guard Staff Sergeant Patrick Hamburger, a native of Lincoln, who later settled in Grand Island, Nebraska. Staff Sergeant Hamburger served his country as a flight engineer while mobilized with the Nebraska Army National Guard. Staff Sergeant Hamburger and 29 fellow soldiers paid the ultimate tribute in support of Operation Enduring Freedom on August 6, 2011. He was the crew chief on the Chinook helicopter downed by enemy fire in Afghanistan. It is through extraordinary sacrifices like his that we are able to enjoy the freedoms that we have today. Staff Sergeant Hamburger's unfaltering devotion to duty and pride in his country went beyond the time he spent in uniform. Patrick lived to help others. From his childhood in Lincoln to mentoring fellow soldiers, those that knew him recall that he was always looking out for others. Patrick's brother, Chris, remembered his kind spirit by stating, and I'm quoting, "He didn't worry about himself half as much as he worried about everyone else. You could have been a complete stranger, and if he could have helped you, he would have done it," unquote. 13 years ago, that mentality and sense of patriotism led a young high school senior to take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the state of Nebraska against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath brought opportunities for Staff Sergeant Hamburger to share his mechanical talent with his fellow soldiers. Those closest to him will tell you that his pride and joy were with his family, his friends, and the V-Day Express, the Chinook helicopter he maintained. He loved being a soldier, and he took great pride in his service. The decorations and badges earned during his 13 years and distinguished service speak to his dedication and to his skill. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Army Reserve Component Achievement Medal, the National Defense Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, the Armed Forces Reserve Medal, the Non-Commissioned Officer Professional Development Ribbon, the Army Service Ribbon, the NATO Medal, the Combat Action Badge, the Senior Aviation Badge, the Nebraska National Guard Homeland Defense Ribbon, the Nebraska National Guard Emergency Service Medal, the Nebraska National Guard Service Medal, and the California National Guard Commendation Medal. These medals, as well as Sergeant Hamburger's willingness to serve others in need, speak clearly to his commitment to upholding the values and ideals that all Nebraskans hold dear. We Nebraskans are proud of his character and the ways in which he represented our state of Nebraska. I am confident that in the coming months, Nebraskans will surround and uplift this family and friends as they mourn the loss of a truly remarkable son, a brother, and a friend. Today, as we all bow our heads with the Hamburger family, I ask that God protect our service members, both here and overseas. We are truly grateful for the service and sacrifice made by those in uniform and their families. Madam President, I yield the floor.